Okay, welcome everyone to another Get Legit webinar, Getting the Good Bugs, How to Farm for Beneficial Insects and Biodiversity with presenter Jessica K. Cruz. Today is Wednesday, May 29th, 2024, and I am your host. My name is Erin. I'm the Education and Communications Manager here at the Cannabis Alliance. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. It is our hope that anyone interested in commercial cannabis here in Nevada County will take the time to tune into these webinars, educate themselves, and continue to be or become stewards of the environment and of our community. The Get Legit educational series provides the preparation necessary to assist in securing a local cultivation permit and state cultivation license. The series includes webinars, support groups, business training skills, and a mentor program. All Get Legit webinars are online, they're free of charge and open to the public. Shout out to our allied industry business sponsors, Ag Natural, Foresters Co-op, Humboldt Seed Company, Happy Sap, Arvin Plant Labs, and Core Real Estate Brokerage. Thank you all so much for your support. Couldn't do this without you. So what is the Alliance? The Alliance is a nonprofit trade association representing the local cannabis community here in Nevada County. Our mission is to support public policy initiatives through representative advocacy, provide educational opportunities, and create space for connection within the industry and the greater community. Some services that we provide to our members are a consistent voice and representation locally and at the Capitol through our statewide partner, Origins Council. Check them out. I'll put the link to their website in the chat, their originscouncil.org. We have monthly educational webinars to assist with the permitting and licensing process, much like the one that you were on today. We have a buddy program to pair permitted farmers with new farmers. We have a Slack online hub for resource sharing and local policy updates, and a seasonal supply chain industry mixers, which we have quarterly. How to stay in touch so you can become a member. I will put that link in the chat, and the perks of becoming a member are the ones I just mentioned above. All of these things I'm going to link into the chat, by the way. You can become a sponsor. Sponsors support the work that we do and help us to aid in our mission, continue the work that we do here in Nevada County for our cannabis farmers. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and that Instagram handle is at Nevada County Alliance. Make sure to follow us, please. We have lots of great content. We have a bi-monthly newsletter, and any additional questions, you can email us at info@nccannabisalliance.org. And again, I'll put those all in the chats. So the format of today's webinar is a Q&A format. Jessica K. Cruz, your presenter, will give a presentation with a Q&A to follow if you have questions. Your participation is encouraged. We have a chat section and a Q&A. Feel free to use and ask any questions that you might have, because this will make the webinar more useful for everyone. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website at nccannabisalliance.org under our Get Legit tab. I'll link that in the chat as well. And then, yeah, Diana, do you have anything to add?
No, thanks everyone for being here.
Awesome.
I do want to actually just say, for those that are following the direct-to-consumer discussion, right, following this webinar at 4:30 p.m., there is going to be a webinar on direct-to-consumer efforts at a local, state, and federal level for small cannabis producers. And the links are in your newsletter that just went out a couple hours ago. So we hope that everyone can join to hear those powerful discussions on how small producers can reach the consumer directly.
Yeah, nice. Thank you, Diana. And that's it for us. I'll go ahead and pass it to Jessa to introduce herself. Thanks for being here, Jessa.
Great. Thank you so much, Erin. It's great to be here today. I'm going to get my presentation up on the screen. So let me know when you can see it. Hold on. I just need to move this away and go. All right. Are you able to see my screen?
Looks great, Jessa.
Okay, I'm gonna see if I can move this. Well, this banner. There we go. Thank you so much. So hi, everybody. My name is Jessica K. Cruz, and I'm going to be talking to you today about getting the good bugs or how to farm for natural enemies. I am the Senior Pollinator Conservation Specialist with the Xerces Society. The Xerces Society is a, whoops. Sorry, I'm trying to advance my slides and they don't, there we go. The Xerces Society is a nonprofit group. We've been around for over 50 years and we work to protect biodiversity through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. We were named after the Xerces blue butterfly, which you see pictured on the slide. Was one of the first invertebrates to go extinct due to human activity, and really highlighted the need for conservation efforts that were targeted specifically at invertebrates. Our motto, one of our mottos at Xerces, is protecting the life that sustains us. And if you think about it, insects in particular really play critical roles in all of our different ecosystems that we rely on really for subsistence. So pollinators, of course, are super important in our food systems. 1 of every 3 bites of food that we eat requires a pollinator. There's also a whole group of bugs that I personally feel like don't get enough love, and those are the what I call the ground bugs. So the insects that live either at the soil level or under the soil. And they're like the recyclers, right? They recycle all the debris and material that ends up on the ground. They break it down and actually turn it into nutrient-rich soil. So without those recyclers, those detritivores, we would be in real trouble. But the insects that I'm going to be talking about today is a different group of insects, and those are what I refer to as natural enemies. So when I say natural enemy, I'm talking about a natural enemy of a crop pest. So one insect that will prey upon and eat crop pests. This slide that you see here is an example of a natural enemy in action. What you're looking at is the larva, so the immature stage of a syrphid fly, and I'll talk more about syrphid flies in a moment, but you're seeing the larva of a syrphid fly eating an aphid. So that's sort of the concept of natural enemies, just in a quick snapshot, and I'll talk a lot more about how to get them on your farm and how to get them to kind of work for you. And I would say that, you know, farms really need natural enemies, and farms of all kinds. So it doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum. It doesn't matter if you are a small producer or really large scale. It doesn't matter if you're organic and no spray, or if you're more conventional. Creating sort of these creating a healthy farm ecosystem is really key to having healthy crops. Those 2 things really go together. And it really works. So getting natural enemies, attracting them onto your farm and keeping them there really does help reduce pest pressure. We've done studies, I have testimonials from producers that I've worked with of all kinds of different cropping systems. We have a lot of data, there's published data really showing the value and the role of natural enemies in managing crop pests. In fact, the average annual estimated annual value of these wild natural enemies to crop production is over $100 billion worldwide. And a lot of times these natural enemies are out there in the landscape doing this work, and sometimes we don't even see them. And this slide is a perfect example. So if you look at this past slide, you can see there's a tortoise beetle, which is a really common pest of some cropping systems. And if you look a little bit closer on the second slide, you can see what you're looking at here is a parasitic wasp attacking a tortoise beetle. I'll talk a lot more about parasitic wasps later, but the take home here is that this wasp is eventually going to kill the tortoise beetle. And so a lot of times these natural enemies are out there in the landscape working for us, and we just don't know they're there because sometimes they're hard to see. So knowing that natural enemies can be really great pest control, the question is, how do I get them, right? How do I get these natural enemies to come onto my farm and to stay there? So there's a couple of key components. One is really that you need to provide the right type of habitat. And I'll talk a lot more about what that means. But habitat is really key. Habitat for natural enemies, and then protecting that habitat that you create, especially from pesticides or other types of disturbances. But creating the habitat and protecting the habitat, like those are the two key pieces to getting natural enemies to show up on your farm. Doesn't even matter what scale you're working at, large scale, small scale, they will come. I'll talk a lot more, I think, about the habitat type and sort of how to create it. But before I do, I thought I'd just kind of go into a little bit of the diversity of the natural enemies. I mean, and I will start by saying there are hundreds and hundreds of natural enemies out there in the landscape, all of these different insects that will prey on crop pests. I'm obviously not going to be able to go through all of them today or make you all, people, an expert on being able to identify them. But I thought I would introduce you to some of the more common natural enemies, because a lot of them you may already be familiar with, or you may have seen on your landscape somewhere and not really known what you were looking at. So it's really helpful just to sort of start recognizing them out there in the landscape. So these are some of the more common natural enemies that you might see. The first one here up in the top corner of the screen is a green lacewing. They're pretty distinct looking as adults. I think they're familiar to most people. They have these bright green bodies and these kind of iridescent colored wings. And then, so that's them as in their adult stage. And then this other photo here, this is a photograph of a green lacewing larva. So this is what they look like in their immature stage. Might be a little less familiar to people. The larvae are relatively small, maybe half an inch in size. And they look like a teeny tiny little miniature alligator. They really do. If you're able to get a close look at one or get a hand lens out, it would be amazing. But they have the 6 little legs, this kind of elongate body, and they almost look like scaly, like a little alligator. And so, and they're voracious. It's in their immature stage that they're really good predators. So green lacewings are a good one to keep your eye out for. The next thing the next beneficial insect that I know is probably really familiar for a lot of people would be the lady beetle. It's the same thing as a ladybug. It's just that technically they're beetles. Bugs are actually a different type of insect. So I call them lady beetles because it's more accurate. And you've all seen the adult lady beetles with the orange bodies with various types of black spots. In their larval stage, they're also kind of this little elongate larva, but their coloration is what makes them really easy to recognize. They have this orange and black body as a larva, very similar to the coloration they have as adults. And as far as I know, they're one of the only larvae that have that coloration. So once you start seeing them, and they're pretty small, but you can see them with your bare eye. And once you start seeing them in the landscape, you'll kind of see them everywhere once you learn to recognize them. So yeah, lady beetles, another great one to have around. Also, the minute pirate bug is another great one. The minute pirate bug, as the name suggests, is a tiny little insect. They're very small, probably less than 1/4 of an inch. But the markings that they have, the pattern that shows up on their body when they have their wings folded like this is pretty distinct. They have like these 2 kind of gold patches and these 2 little black patches behind that, and then this little white patch on the very tip of their abdomen. So it almost makes like these diamond patterns. Again, pretty distinct looking. It's a very small insect. Sometimes you need a hand lens to see it, but they are amazing predators, and they will eat insects that are like twice their size, and they'll just take them down. So, and like I said, they're pretty common in the landscape. I wanted to quickly mention wasps. People generally don't think of wasps as beneficial. Obviously, a lot of people are, a little scared about getting stung by a wasp. But a lot of wasps, not so much yellow jackets. Yellow jackets are one type of wasp. But a lot of our other wasps, like our paper wasps or our mud dauber wasps, are actually really good predators because the adult females going out and they're actually hunting, they're catching prey and then bringing that prey back to the nest to feed their young. So they're constantly catching things like caterpillars or other soft-bodied insects to feed to their young. So if there's a nest somewhere where it's not going to hurt someone, maybe leave it because they will go to work for you. I wanted to mention spiders as well. Obviously, spiders technically are not an insect, right? Spiders have 8 legs, insects have 6. Spiders are arachnids, so they're their own category all in and of themselves. But I did want to add them on because they're great predators and they're also kind of a sign of good ecosystem health. So, not so much like, some of our, not so much our black widows, but some of the orb spiders or garden spiders, those types of groups of spiders are really, really good predators. And if you see a lot of them showing up in your garden or on your farm, that can be a sign that you have like a really good, healthy ecosystem. And then finally, I wanted to mention syrphid flies down here in the lower corner. Syrphid flies are known as bee mimics. And if you look at them, you can see they look a lot like bees. They have kind of that black and yellow body, but they're not bees, they're flies. And they are also excellent predators. That other slide that I showed you was of the syrphid fly larva eating an aphid. So especially as larvae when they're really excellent predators. So all of these different insects will eat pests. They're relatively common for cannabis, things like aphids, mites, mealybugs, caterpillars, white flies, a lot of really common pest insects. There's another group of insects that people don't think of as beneficial that I wanted to mention, and these are our predaceous ground beetles. So these are little, usually brown or black, kind of innocuous looking beetles. They're not that little, actually. They're kind of medium to larger size beetles. They come out generally at dusk or at nighttime. During the day, they're just hunkered down in cracks in the soil or underneath leaf litter or under logs, things like that. And they are voracious predators and they will actually chase down their prey. So they can run really fast. And they will prey on insects much bigger than they are. They consume their body weight in prey on a daily basis. So they really eat a lot of other insects, especially caterpillars, grasshoppers, and like other beetles. So they're really great to have around for pest control for that reason. And then this last group of natural enemies that I wanted to mention are the parasitic flies and the parasitic wasps. And this is a really fascinating group that encompasses multiple species. It's a really fascinating group of natural enemies. Parasitic flies and wasps will lay their eggs either on top of or actually inside the body of their host. And when that egg hatches, it will consume the host. So they're very host specific. So you can, target specific pests this way. Almost every pest insect has a known parasitoid wasp or fly. And what you see in this picture right here, this is a parasitic wasp. And it's actually stinging, it's injecting an egg inside the body of this aphid. And when that egg hatches, it will consume the aphid from the inside out and just leaving nothing but a shell behind. And you have probably all seen parasitized aphids. You may not have known that's what you're looking at, but if you see some aphids on a leaf, normally a healthy aphids, if you look at the backside of the leaf, you'll see aphids are usually kind of bright green or some other bright color. They're kind of glistening. They look kind of plump. A parasitized aphid looks, as you can see in this photo, it looks kind of like a brown desiccated shell. And that's because it's basically what it is. Once that parasitoid hatches, it consumes the aphid from the inside out. And then if you look really closely, this is a little tiny exit hole and it'll actually chew its way out of the aphid and so that it can go in search of more prey and leave just this desiccated mummy behind. So if you're doing any kind of monitoring of aphids and you're looking, and other pest insects too, but aphids are probably the most common, look to see if they're being parasitized, because if they are, you may have you may have your problem taken care of, because those parasitic wasps will go to town. So now that I've talked a little bit about the different natural enemies that you might see out on the landscape, I want to kind of move over and talk a little bit about the type of habitat to provide in order to not just attract these insects, but to maintain them. And also, if you're, a person who likes purchases natural enemies, because people will do this, you can buy beneficial insects and release them on your farm or on your property, and that's a great thing to do. But they're not going to stick around permanently, and their populations aren't going to build year over year unless you have the right type of habitat. And I will also add that if you do have really good habitat, you may not need to purchase and release these beneficials, because they'll show up. So what does habitat provide? Why is it so important for beneficials? Well, first of all, habitat provides food, primarily pollen and nectar. So a lot of these beneficial insects might be predaceous, so feeding on other insects in their immature stage. So when they're larvae, right? In their immature stage, that's when a lot of these beneficials will prey on other insects. But as adults, many of them feed on pollen or nectar. So if you want them to stick around and complete their life cycle, and you want the population to keep building, they're going to need that pollen and nectar. And then other beneficials, they just use pollen and nectar to supplement their diet. So they might be predaceous at all life stages, like lady beetles, for example. But they also need the amino acids and the carbohydrates and some of the other nutrients that are provided by pollen and nectar to really have like a complete diet. So having lots of things that bloom are really important. The other thing that habitat provides is shelter. So just like every other animal, insects need shelter. They need specifically overwintering areas, and they need egg-laying sites. So they need stems, leaves, woody materials, piles of debris, all of the things that that plants provide. Different insect groups will use those for overwintering, for egg laying. Bunch grasses is another one that they use for shelter a lot. And then I think the third component that natural habitat provides ideally would be protection or refuge from pesticides. Obviously, working lands, pesticides are often part of that equation. So there needs to be a place where these beneficial insects can go and be protected and not be subject to any, pesticide exposure. And I'll talk a little bit more about some specific techniques later on, but those are really the three components. And we, again, have a lot of studies, and I'll share some data with you all, but we have a lot of studies that really show this direct link between high quality habitat and robust populations of beneficial insects. So we know it works. The first thing I would say, so people ask, like, okay, so what is habitat? Habitat is basically plants, right? And then the next question is, well, what plants should I put in? And it does really matter. Putting in the right plants is really important. You could plant a whole bunch of things and not have beneficials show up if they're really not the right type of plant. So the most important thing I would emphasize is plant native plants, right? Because these beneficial insects, most of them are native. They're just out there in the landscape. They co-evolved with all of these native plants. So the native plants are always going to be the best for supporting these natural enemies. So that's sort of the number one rule. And then, of course, native plants are really, generally drought tolerant. They're really adapted to local growing conditions. And oftentimes they'll also benefit other types of wildlife. For example, the types of plants that pollinators use are very similar to the types of plants that are used by natural enemies. There's a ton of overlap. So there are some resources that I'll share with you later that will link you to some plant lists and things like that are mostly focused on pollinators, but again, have really good benefits for natural enemies. It is important to have things that are kind of blooming from really early in the season, like early in the spring, all the way through the fall, because these different natural enemies have different life cycles, different emergence times. Just having like consistent sources of pollen and nectar, really important. I put this link here, and Erin will be able to share some of these links with folks, but our resource center has plant lists that have a lot of information about what's good for natural enemies, but I just picked like kind of my top 4, at least I went by genus. So my top 4 genera for the region that you all are in, for Nevada County. Although these plants grow, beyond that county. But the first one would be milkweed. People know milkweed as being the host plant for the monarch butterfly, which is a great reason to plant it. But it's also incredible for natural enemies. And I see so many different beneficial insects using milkweed. So it's a really, really good one. Another one would be the native buckwheat, or Eriogonum. It's generally really easy to grow. It's a tough little plant, pretty easy to establish, really an attractive plant and great for beneficials. So that's another one I would recommend. Yarrow is another excellent plant, or Achillea is the Latin name. You've probably all seen yarrow around. It's really common, and as you all know, it's probably really easy to grow. I see lots of serpent flies and lots of lady beetles using that plant. So it's another really good one. And then finally, California lilac, or Ceanothus is the Latin name. Really great foothill plant, absolutely gorgeous. And again, really attractive to beneficials. And these different plants kind of bloom. I kind of try to include things that bloom at different times, like Ceanothus is really early blooming, buckwheat tends to be later blooming, and then the milkweed and yarrow are somewhere in the middle. So I mean, ideally you would plant more than 4, but I just wanted to give people an idea of like where to get started. I want to talk also now, so I've kind of given an overview of some of the plants you might think about using. I want to talk now about some of the habitat features. So the people, it's sort of an abstract concept, like, what do you mean plant habitat? Like, what does that look like? And honestly, it can look like anything. It could be a garden. It could be anything that fits into your landscape, your farm, whatever. But I wanted to share some of the more common types of features that a lot of producers, a lot of agricultural producers use on their farms. So one of the most common would be flowering hedgerows, which generally consist of a mixture of flowering shrubs, sometimes a few small trees, and sometimes some smaller plants, often some native bunch grasses. They tend to be linear plantings. They're often like along farm roads or along roadsides. They can be great because they can also provide privacy screening, or protect areas from dust or from wind, things like that. So they can also protect the crops if they're, placed in the right location where the prevailing winds are coming from. So they can kind of do double duty that way. And again, like a good hedgerow for beneficial insects would have things blooming throughout the season and would be protected, of course, from pesticide drift. Oh, and they also can provide a lot of nesting structure and just general shelter for beneficials as well, because they have bunch grasses and woody plants and a lot of different, larger plants and smaller plants as well. If you don't have room for a hedgerow, because some of those shrubs get a little bit big, I would say you'd want at least 10 feet of width to plant a hedgerow. And if you don't have an area that's 10 feet wide, but you have just smaller areas, you could think about including an insectary strip. An insectary strip is basically just, it doesn't really have any woody plants. It's basically herbaceous plants or wildflowers, sometimes some grasses mixed in. So just smaller stature flowers. They could be perennial or annual. And what's really nice about an insectary strip is it can be a really tiny little narrow strip, but still be really functional. These are insects. They don't need a ton of space. So I've seen people incorporate these like sort of between blocks on the same farm, or again, just like edges of areas, equipment yards, around houses, just anywhere that you can kind of just fit in a little bit of some flowering plants. Beetle banks are really interesting habitat type. They're actually quite popular in the Midwest, and I think kind of starting to catch on a little bit more in California. But a beetle bank is a permanent strip of native bunch grasses. So like deer grass or purple needle grass, like a lot of our native grasses are clumpy. We call those bunch grasses. As I mentioned before, when I was talking about those predaceous ground beetles, the beetles like to nest and shelter sort of underneath the bunch grasses because they're cool and it's damp under there. So they hang out under there and then they come out at night and they hunt. So this is an example of a beetle bank that's been incorporated into a really diverse organic farm system where she just put them in between different types of crops. If this is all super overwhelming to you, don't worry, we can help. Xerces has what we call our Habitat Kit program. It is a kind of like sophisticated plant giveaway program. So we basically provide plants and technical assistance free of charge for qualifying projects. So we do all the work in figuring out what are the best plants to plant for these different beneficial insects and for different regions of the state. So we have all these different types of kits depending on, you know, what you're looking for and where you're located. There is an application process. So I put the web link there so people can go for more information. A qualifying project would be any kind of cropland or working land, so farms and ranches. We're state funded. We don't have any restrictions or concerns about legality. So cannabis growers are totally eligible for this program, as are any other cropping systems. Also, public land is eligible, just in case, you know, you're people who wear many hats. Schools, parks, public spaces are also eligible to participate in this program, and tribal land is also eligible. So reach out to me or check our web page if you want more information. But if you're ready to get serious about creating habitat and you want a little help, I think this is a really good opportunity for people. I promised I would share some data. So I just want to talk about a couple of studies really quickly. This was a published study. One of the lead authors was Rachel Long. She was with UC Extension in Yolo County for decades. I think she recently retired, but she really dedicated a lot of her professional life to doing this work. This study looked at parasitism of the stink bug, and stink bugs are very common pests for tomatoes. So they looked at parasitism of stink bugs in tomato fields adjacent to hedgerows as compared to tomato fields that had no surrounding habitat. So there's this little parasitic wasp, again, that will parasitize the stink bug, actually the stink bug eggs, and you know, kill them before they even hatch. So what the study found out was that the parasitism rate was 3 times as high in the tomato fields adjacent to hedgerows as it was in tomato fields that had no surrounding habitat. So it's nice to have this really local study. This was done in Yolo County. It's great to have a fairly local study really showing this concept in action. The other data slide I wanted to share is my own data from a 3-year study that I did. This is unpublished data. It was a grant that was supported by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, looking at beneficial insects and or natural enemies and cover crops. So we did some cover crop planting in perennial cropping systems like almonds and vineyards, kind of between the rows, and we monitored those areas, those cover cropped areas, for natural enemies, and then compared those to control sites that were basically just what would naturally grow in an orchard understory if you did not plant a cover crop, which is typically a mix of different weeds. And so what I found when I did the monitoring of the control sites versus the planted cover crops, where we deliberately designed these cover crops to be attractive to natural enemies, we found 14 times the number of natural enemies at the sites where the cover crops were planted as compared to the control sites. And it's the same group of natural enemies that I shared with you all earlier: lady beetles, lacewings, spiders, wasps, serpent flies, and minute pirate bug. So some really good data coming out of that study. And these were all farms that were in California. So I've talked a little bit about the insects, and I've talked a little bit about the types of habitat and the types of plants that you might want to include. And I want to wind up or end with talking about some of the farm practices. So some of the management aspects of creating habitat for beneficial insects, because I feel like that's sort of the last piece of the puzzle here. So for starters, tillage is generally not a great method for either creating or maintaining habitat or for transitioning from between crops. Tillage, a lot of these beneficial insects will nest down in the ground, nest or overwinter in the ground. They don't always stay at the hedgerow or wherever your habitat is. They might spread out on the landscape. So you're risking like tilling up and destroying those nesting habitats or those overwintering sites when you till. If you are tilling because you want to, say, plant a hedgerow, that's usually not something, because it's usually what people, the first thing they want to do if they're going to plant a new area is people always want to go out and till. And tillage also tends to exacerbate weed problems because it just brings up, we have such a huge seed bank of weed seeds in our soil. So when you till, it just tends to bring more and more weeds up to the surface. So I just generally don't recommend tillage for a variety of reasons. So that's sort of the first farm practice. The other practice really that needs to be addressed and really thought and treated really thoughtfully would be pesticides. So at a minimum, when you create a habitat area, you want to make sure that area is protected from pesticides, right? Because you don't want to go to all this work to attract all these natural enemies onto your farm and then end up, killing them all because, they got their habitat got sprayed with pesticides. So creating some kind of a spatial buffer between any cropped areas where you might be applying pesticides and any habitat areas is really important. And this is true even if you're an organic producer. So a lot of times people tell me, oh, I'm organic, so like what I'm using, it's not gonna hurt anything. But think about it, if you're using an organic insecticide, it's still an insecticide, right? It's still going to kill or still going to harm insects. And most pesticides are really not that targeted, most insecticides. So it's going to kill the good bugs along with the bad ones. So just really judicious use is really important, but obviously at least protecting your habitat area. The spatial buffer, because people always ask, well, how big a buffer do I need? And it totally depends on what you're spraying, how you're spraying it, when you're spraying it. There's so many factors. Xerces can actually provide you with a risk assessment. So if people provide us with the information about what they're spraying and how, we can actually tell you what our recommended buffers would be. But as a general rule of thumb, buffers would range from like 20 feet for, say, a scenario when someone's applying with something like a backpack sprayer, which has a really low risk of drift, and maybe they're applying mostly not super toxic products. And that buffer could go all the way up to like 100 feet. And that would be for people using an air blast sprayer, which is probably not relevant for cannabis use. Usually they're used in orchards where they need to shoot something really up high into trees. And it would be for more toxic pesticides. So that's the whole range. And that's why I tell people, like, I can't tell you, like, not without knowing more information, I can't tell you how big a buffer you need. But that's some guidance. And again, we're always happy to provide more if people want an individualized recommendation. And then in addition to just providing those buffers, of course, even with those buffers, like anything you do on your farm, like if we're thinking about the farm as a whole ecosystem, you want a healthy ecosystem, across all of your land as a whole. So practicing really just good, solid, integrated pest management practices go a long ways toward reducing the impacts of pesticides. So, we call it the three-legged stool. Prevention is super important, trying to keep your plants healthy and avoid anything that will exacerbate pest outbreaks. Most producers are already doing this, but just a reminder. Monitoring is another piece of it. So remember I was talking about aphids, maybe monitoring for parasitized aphids as well as for live aphids, maybe monitoring for beneficial insects as well as monitoring for pest insects, because it's really the ratio of beneficials to pests that are going to determine an action. And if you only know what the pests are, you're missing a really big piece of information. And certainly monitoring so that you have, some kind of defined action thresholds. Maybe you can tolerate sort of low levels of certain pests without a problem. So yeah, so monitoring is super important. And then of course, there are times that, maybe you need to take that action and apply some kind of pesticide. And then it just becomes about limiting harm, trying to pick products that are less toxic, trying to pick methods that reduce drift. Both of those are really important. The time of day that you spray, like spraying at night, can be really helpful because most of these beneficial insects are not active and they're somewhat protected in the nighttime. So those are just some methods for reducing risk. These two resources are really good and I use them all the time. One of them is regarding pesticide toxicity. So if you're trying to figure out like what pesticide might be the least impactful to beneficial insects, the website is called Bee Precaution. As the name suggests, it's really focused on honeybees, but you can really extrapolate a lot of data, because if something is toxic to honeybees, you can assume it probably has some toxicity to other insects as well, including natural enemies. So it's a really good user-friendly database. And then for just general tools for pest management, I'm sure you're probably already familiar with UCIPM, but this is the web address right here, and they really have great information on managing for specific. You can search by specific pests and get some really good information on managing them. So I recommend those two resources for pest information and pesticide information. And then I just wanted to kind of end with a couple of final thoughts. One is that as the single largest land use on Earth, excuse me, as the single largest land use on Earth, farming is really critical to the future of biodiversity. If we want a planet that is balanced and biodiverse, we need to have farms that are those things as well. But I would also really flip that on its head and say biodiversity is really critical to the future of farming. So if we want sustainable farms that we can pass on to our kids or our grandkids, we want to be thinking about having farms that have biodiversity and that are really healthy ecosystems. So with that, I'm going to stop my sharing and try to get my voice back. Give me a second, and then I can take some questions.
Oh, that was awesome, Jessa. And yeah, I can understand if I was talking for that long, I would need a break too. So thank you so much for everything. That was great. All of the links that, let me get my video back on. All of the links that Jessa shared during the webinar are in the chat. So feel free to open those up and save them. Or you can always come back to the webinar recording when I post it in about a week. And then, yeah, that was awesome. That was amazing, Jessa. Really, like, I think the one thing that really stood out to me was the parasitic wasps, and that was so cringy and gross, but it's so amazing.
Super gross.
so fascinating. This is just so much information that I think is so useful for our craft cannabis farmers in the community. This is amazing. So now is the time for any questions, and it looks like we have someone in the Q&A. Nels, hi Nels. What are some other native plants you recommend for hedgerows?
Oh, that's a great question. So in addition to the 4 that I shared, I definitely advocate for including some kind of bunch grasses and hedgerows. Deer grass is a really good one because it's easy to grow, grows in your region. Lots of things use it for nesting and overwintering. So that's a really good one. Um, Manzanita, I think, is great. Coffeeberry, toyon, these are all shrubs that kind of grow in the foothill region. And for smaller plants, things like penstemons or salvias are really good sources of pollen and nectar. We have one of the links that I provided takes you to our pollinator conservation resource center, and there's a drop down of plant lists there. And if you go, so it's a lot of it's really focused on pollinators. I had mentioned that before, but if you actually click on the plant list for your region, and we have a Sierra Foothill plant list, which is probably the most relevant for Nevada County. But if you go to that plant list, there's a little key in there and it shows you which of the plants on that list are specifically good for natural enemies as well as pollinators. So you can just kind of comb through that list and start picking things out. But and as I mentioned before, a lot of the plants that support pollinators are also heavily used by natural enemies. There's a ton of overlap, and there's a lot more information on pollinator plants out there. So you can also just kind of go with, if it's good for a pollinator, it's probably going to be good for beneficials because they're all using the pollen and the nectar that these plants provide. So yeah, it's a commonality there.
Awesome. Thanks, Jessa. There's another follow-up question. Where do you recommend getting these seeds for hedgerows?
Yeah, I think that part is can be really challenging. And actually, it's one of the reasons that we started the Habitat Kit program is because people have such a hard time sourcing native plants. There are a couple of great native plant nurseries, somewhat locally. One of them is Cornflower Farms. So that's down in Elk Grove, which is just south of Sacramento. They're great, really big nursery, really high quality plants. There's also a good native plant nursery up in Chico. Trying to remember the name of it, and it's totally escaping me right now. Oh my gosh, it'll come to me. But yeah, but if you Google native plants, Chico, California, it would probably come up because it's the only nursery up there. And then if you go to the Xerces website, we also have actually a nursery directory because I know there's some like smaller nurseries probably closer to Nevada County that carry native plants. The Nevada, your local California Native Plant Society or CNPS chapter might be able to help you with more local nurseries. I kind of work statewide, so I don't always know what's going on in individual counties, but yeah, Cornflower Farms is probably would be my top pick.
Awesome. And Rob Katz, hi Rob. Looks like he put in the Floral Native Nursery in
That's
Chico.
it. Thank you, Rob. Floral
Yep.
Native Nursery in Chico. I don't know why. I've shopped there so much. I don't know why the name just flew out of my head. So thank you for that.
And there's another resource he put in here. It's called Calscape. You can put your zip code in and get a list of native plants for your area, plus a nursery directory. Have you heard of that one?
Yes, that's right. So Calscape is actually run by the California Native Plant Society. And thank you for reminding me of that because they just revamped their website and their new website is gorgeous. It's such a huge improvement. I've been wanting to tell them that. It's really lovely. They just launched it in the last week or so. And yeah, I think it's set up now that you can do a search and it will take you to the top native plant nurseries in your area. It'll pull a bunch of options up, or just nurseries that maybe they don't sell only native plants, but they at least have a good selection of natives. And again, the native plants are just so much more drought tolerant and easier to grow and definitely the most attractive. And traditionally our native plant industry has been small, but it's really growing as these plants gain popularity. So hopefully that will help with availability. But yeah, Calscape is fantastic.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for that, Rob. And then there's another comment here from Rob, Hedgerow Farms near Davis.
Yeah,
that
so
one?
if you're interested in growing seeds, Hedgerow Farms I think they're technically in Winters, but yeah, Hedgerow Farms is a really good native seed nursery. I think they also carry maybe some plugs or like small transplants. And then Heritage Growers, which is a nonprofit nursery, a relatively new one in Colusa County, is also a really good one if you're like wanting to do, say you wanted to do like a wildflower planting from seed or something like that, or plugs, which are just like small transplants. So for like wildflowers and grasses, Heritage Growers or Hedgerow Farms are both really good options.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you for all the comments and questions, everyone. Are there any other questions? Any comments? Put them in now while you can. Even if something was already gone over, we can go over it again. No worries. Give moments for people to type in some questions.
And people are certainly welcome to follow up with me via email. So if you think of questions that you didn't ask today, shoot me an email and I'll try to get back to you with more information. Yeah, and I'm sorry that I lost my voice partway through. I have terrible allergies, so I think just was having a little bit of an allergy attack, but I think it's under control now.
Oh, I'm the same. I have the worst allergies in the world. I totally get that. What's your email again, Jess? I'm gonna put it in the chat. I don't have my ability to peruse on my Google.
Oh, here, I can put it in. I think that will be easier. Let me type it into the, let me type it into.
Yeah, feel free to follow up with Jess with any questions. You're welcome, Sebastian. Sebastian, thank you very much. Highly inspirational. Appreciate that comment.
Oh, me too.
Yeah, it's very nice. Awesome. Okay. All right. So it looks like that's all we have for Q&A. Any other questions, send to Jessa after the webinar. And yeah, that's a wrap for us, guys. Thank you all so much for joining us for this wonderful Get Legit webinar with Jessa K. Cruz. Thank you for joining us, Jessa.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you everybody for tuning in. It was super fun.
Yeah, this is awesome. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Bye.